Russia and Ukraine have engaged in one of the biggest prisoner exchanges since the war began. Around 300 prisoners of war were transferred in a deal brokered by the United Arab Emirates. The Russian Defence Ministry said it swapped 150 Ukrainian soldiers held captive for an equal number of Russian troops. Well, here to explain the significance of the exchange, Tim White, who's a documentary maker and Ukraine specialist. Good evening, Tim.
Good evening, Kate. Delighted to be here on the evening edition. My debut, I think, on this programme.
It certainly is. Thank you for being with us. Look, this war, since Russia's full-scale invasion, we're not strangers to prisoner swap deals, but this one's particularly big, isn't it?
Yes, it's been a long time in coming. If you remember, in the early days of the war, we used to get 30 and 50 and sometimes 70, seldom 100 exchanged. And then it dried up. Now, obviously, both sides are blaming each other. But I think most people tend to side with Ukraine and say that it's more likely to be the Russians blocking, especially as they're making more advances on the battlefield. So even though they are losing a lot of prisoners, there's also a lot of evidence, anecdotal evidence, some of it, albeit, but a lot of video evidence that Russians are shooting rather than taking prisoners as well. So maybe they have slightly fewer needs to exchange at the moment. But having said that, as you say, it's fantastic news for the families concerned on both sides, and of course for the prisoners themselves, who've had to endure pretty awful conditions for the last 2.5 years for some of them.
Yeah. Do we know anything about the conditions in which they've been held captive?
Well, we know that inspectors are allowed into Ukrainian prisons. We know that journalists have been there and reported, and they report the conditions are fine. However, you could say that, well, they would say that, and they're in control of when inspections happen. But on the other side, no one's allowed into Russian prisons. So we have to have a look at the photographs and hear from the interviews and speak with people like Sean Pinder, the former British POW, whom we have spoken to before on Times Radio. And they describe regular torture, meagre food rations. We have photographs of people coming out having lost over a third of their body weight, really emaciated, bringing back horror images of the likes of Belsen in the Second World War. The similarities are indisputable. So on one side, we think that the Russians are being treated, not amazingly, but certainly with the expectations of the Geneva Convention on prisoners of war. But on the other side, there's ample evidence to say this is not the case for Ukrainians who've been in captivity.
Is there any significance at all with the fact that Donald Trump will be inaugurated on the 20th of January and the prospect, the outlook for this war may change when he does?
Yes, possibly. Whether it's come into this or not, Kate, is very difficult to be precise. I think we're only speculating here, but I think, also, there's quite a lot of domestic pressure back home for Putin. Yes, they're making inroads into Ukrainian defences on the battleground quite significantly. But having said that, it's still only like a kilometre at a time, and then a kilometre in the next week, and then maybe 5 kilometres. And in a vast country like Ukraine, that isn't a huge amount, but it does add up. And it's certainly caused a little drop in morale of Ukrainian supporters, Ukrainians themselves, and people on the front line fighting for Ukraine. But on the other side, for people in Russia, largely unaffected by the war, doesn't really mean much. But what they see at home is that right now prices are skyrocketing. The Russians say inflation's only about 10%, but most people, having totted up the figures, show that it's over 25%. Mortgage rates, some are discounted by the state, but the general interest rate of businesses is way over 20% now. And there's a real problem. The ruble has been devaluing again today. It's now gone to 110 for the dollar, around about 137 to the pound, I think. And, pre-war levels, it was not even 100. So you can tell that everything's getting more expensive. The imports, the Russians aren't going to be able to afford foreign holidays, even though they can still go to some places, particularly the likes of Egypt and Turkey. And so it's starting to affect people at home, and that causes discontent in whatever country, even if you're not at war. We've seen it in this country during COVID when interest rates and inflation started to really rocket. And so Putin has got to do something to bring back the goodwill. And New Year is their biggest holiday. They still celebrate Christmas, but due to the Orthodox calendar, that doesn't come for another week yet. And so the New Year's, stretching from communist times when they tried to kind of ban Christmas as an atheist regime, and New Year was when they have their version of Father Christmas and swap all the presents. So that's the huge family time, like our Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And that's why that Russia, I think, needed this big deal to go through now so they could show happy faces of released prisoners reunited with their families, which they've allowed journalists to film as well from the West tonight as well, which I think is a step more than the usual.
Yeah, it is. It certainly is significant. It is or will be tomorrow on New Year's Eve, 25 years that Vladimir Putin's been in power. It was the day, New Year's Eve 1999, the day that Boris Yeltsin resigned and Putin became acting president. He was prime minister at the time, became acting president. And I wonder from your work and your research and your coverage across this area, how Vladimir Putin has changed over those 25 years. What kind of acting president was he? How did he start off his tenure? And how much has he changed now in his approach to how he considers Russia, what he desires for the country?
It's a very difficult question, isn't it? I think, to answer that second bit first, I think he's become more insular. And I think, like all dictators and all people who fix elections, they become ever more paranoid, even though he was very clever in making power almost exclusively in his own hands very early, isolating his rivals, jailing them, expelling them, taking companies off them so that they were emasculated in financial terms. And he's still very paranoid. You know, he lives in a bunker most of the time. And I think, therefore, he is afraid. And that is probably why he's become more and more violent as we've seen it. Although even in fairly early days, he did say how it was the biggest mistake to let the Soviet Union collapse. And then a little bit later, how he was going to reunite those countries because really they were all Soviet territories, Russian territories, and particularly the likes of Ukraine. And he started, obviously, the war there, not just in 2022, as a lot of us tend to remember, but back in 2014 with the invasion. And illegal annexation of Crimea with a referendum that was a farce held at gunpoint. But in the early days, of course, a lot of Western politicians were gleeful that Russia had dropped the Iron Curtain, or the Soviet Union at the time had, and that these countries were then getting their independence. Then Putin, as you say, came to power. And people kind of forgot that he was an ex-KGB, FSB agent. And he was very hospitable to the West, got what he wanted from them at the time, was allowed to start a war in Chechnya. And there's still a lot of rumors, and you can search this online, there's whole videos and documentaries about it. But a lot of people believe that he, because of evidence that the FSB planted bombs in apartments in Russia to breed hatred and distrust of Chechen people, the separatism movement there at the time, and then start the war there. And as we know, when a nation is at war, people tend to be very nationalistic, and it tends to be very good for leaders. So a strong president coming in saying, I will stop this terrorism, with no one questioning whether he did it or not allowed to question it publicly, of course. But whatever, the first Chechen war happened, then there was a moment of calm, there was a real clampdown on crime, mafia crime, which a lot of people welcomed. Largely guns were taken from the streets. So we did a lot of good for Russia, and the economy boomed, of course, because there was a lot of opportunity for us in the West to deal with Russia, and all the corporate giants went in there. And so people had a lot of good times, and especially with a huge country, very rich in natural resources, and they've lived off the profits of oil and gas for a long time. But now it's really hitting hard because those exports are becoming more difficult. They've got fewer clients. People like India that still trade with them, that many of us are upset with, are demanding ever lower prices because there's no market. And so, as it said, it comes back to Putin having to be very careful about domestic policy and the reactions of the normal Russian person on the street or in the village right now. And so whether he's changed or not from 1999, or whether this was always his master plan in the long run, I think you can make arguments on both sides. Probably he's become a bit more firm. He's become a bit more emboldened because he's seen that dictators don't have to deal with elections. And in the West, democracy will always mean people will be protesting violently against war, and for altruistic reasons. None of us wants war, but sometimes the most important thing to defend is democracy, and you have to fight for peace.
Look, thanks so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. Tim White, documentary maker and Ukraine specialist. Thank you.